Jesus was born in tumultuous times. The events of his birth included a census, a massacre, a flight to Egypt, and many other things besides, and Matthew and Luke took these events to be significant, to frame Jesus as the fulfillment of biblical history, but each writer focused on different aspects of them. For Matthew, Jesus is a Moses-like deliverer, who presents an immediate threat to the world's Herods. As far as Matthew is concerned, Jesus' presentation at the temple and childhood in Nazareth are irrelevant, and to include them would be a distraction. Meanwhile, for Luke, Jesus is a more subversive and Samuel-like figure, who grows up in and around the temple. From Luke's perspective, then, Jesus' stay in Bethlehem, after his presentation at the temple, and flight to Egypt are irrelevant, while his presentation at the temple and undramatic childhood are highly relevant. That Matthew and Luke don't write the way we might expect is, therefore, quite true, but it's evidence not of their ahistoricity, but of the purpose and sophistication of their narratives, not to mention the climactic nature of their Messiah's entrance into world history. If, by today's standards, that makes elements of their narratives ahistorical, then it makes elements of their narratives ahistorical. But trustworthiness and conformity to modern-day expectations are two different things. Ultimately, if we want to engage with Matthew and Luke in a fruitful way, we need to engage with them on their own terms rather than on the basis of our expectations. Now, why has Matthew chosen to tell us about these events in particular, rather than those described by Luke? What's their common theme connection? The answer is that Matthew is distinctly Exodus-shaped events, which portray Jesus' birth as a sign of an Exodus to come. Consider some of the relevant parallels. Both stories, Matthew and the Exodus, open with Israel ruled by a foreign overlord, in one case an Egyptian, in the other an Edomite. Both revolve around the birth of a child who's destined to deliver his people. In both cases, the overlord in question views the child as a threat. Both stories have the overlord massacre Israel's infants in an attempt to secure his position. In both stories, God's deliverer flees to a foreign land, where he holds out until his enemies have passed away. In both stories, God outwits his enemies. And in both stories, God's people are made rich by the Gentiles. These parallels are no coincidence. Indeed, in Matthew 2 verse 15, Matthew explains the significance of Joseph's sojourn in Egypt by the citation of Hosea 11 verse 1. "Out of Egypt I called my son." Just as God began a redemptive work in Moses' day, when he called Israel forth from Egypt, so in Joseph's day God will again call his son forth from Egypt and begin an even greater redemptive work. Matthew's allusions to the Exodus are not simply a vague anticipation of redemption. They outline a deliberately inverted Exodus story. Everything is back to front. The murderous king is not an Egyptian pharaoh, but a king of the Jews. The land in which God's son is imperiled is not Egypt, but Israel. And the land where the son is accepted is not Israel, but Egypt. Why? Because Jesus' Exodus won't simply be a rerun of the original, it will be a different kind of Exodus. The line of division between God's people and God's enemies won't be drawn on the basis of nationality, Israel versus Egypt, but on the basis of obedience. And on the night of the Passover to come, God's firstborn son won't escape death. That Matthew's allusions to the Exodus are intentional is confirmed by their echoes in Matthew's genealogy. Consider, for a start, the notion of a foreign ruler who massacres a host of infants in Israel. Matthew's genealogy also draws our attention to such a ruler, which it does by means of a conspicuous lacuna in its king list. Suppose I tell you I spent last Christmas with my mom, my brothers, and my sisters. While my statement is ostensibly about my mom, brothers, and sisters, it draws most attention, somewhat paradoxically, to my dad, since it makes you wonder why I haven't mentioned him. Matthew's genealogy works in a similar way. After Jehoram aka Joram, the next king mentioned in Matthew's genealogy is Jehoram's great-great-grandson, Azariah aka Uzziah. Matthew thus fails to mention three Judahite kings, Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah. Why does Matthew omit these three kings? Part of the answer is to draw our attention to a notable sequence of events that transpired in their days. The accession of Ahaziah was a notable event in and of itself, since Ahaziah was the son of Jehoram and Athaliah was a daughter of the recently cursed Ahab. Ahaziah thus represented an unwelcome injection of foreign blood and behavior into David's line. And a year later, an even more notable event took place. Ahaziah died without any sons old enough to succeed him, at which point Athaliah sought to slay all the potential heirs to the throne and claim it for herself. Mercifully, however, Ahaziah's sister managed to spare Ahaziah's youngest son, Joash, and hide him away, protected by a Gentile guard, until he was old enough to reign. Consider, then, the situation. We have a foreign ruler in charge of Israel, an illegitimate king of the Jews, a newborn child who is a threat to the ruler's authority, an attempt to extinguish the line of promise, and a member of royal family who has hidden the child away in a foreign environment. Ring any bells? It should do. It's another Exodus event. Matthew's king list thus fulfills at least two important functions. First, it underscores the unity of theme of Matthew's narrative. And second, it underscores the threat presented by Jesus. Jesus is a legitimate heir to the throne of David, born in the right place at the right time, which is why Herod has to eliminate him. A final Exodus-like feature of Matthew's genealogy can be identified in its allusions to the riches of the Gentiles. Its 14-fold periodicity highlights four individuals: Abraham, David, Jeconiah, and Jesus, all of whom receive considerable help and riches from Gentile rulers' nations. Abraham emerges from Egypt not only unscathed, but enriched by the land's silver and gold. David finds temporary refuge among the Philistines and is given silver and gold by Gentile kings, as is his son, Solomon. Jeconiah is shown special favor by the king of Babylon, as is his son, Zerubbabel, who emerges from Babylon with silver and gold. And, as we've seen, Jesus himself is preserved in a Gentile land and made rich by gifts from foreign lands. In sum, Matthew's birth narrative is a careful and sophisticated composition, tied together by a clear unity of theme. True, that doesn't make Matthew's narrative historical, but it does help to explain Matthew's selection of material. In the view of many commentators, Matthew and Luke's birth narratives can't both be historically accurate because Matthew shows no awareness of Luke's census or Joseph's journey to Bethlehem. How then do such commentators think Matthew's narrative should have been written? Well, suppose we rewrite it like this. And so all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ 14 generations. Now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way: when his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And at about that time, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered, which was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. Matthew's narrative is now more consistent with Luke's, right? By the same token, however, it's far less lucid. As we've seen, Matthew's genealogy is crafted in such a way as to anticipate Herod's hostility, and Matthew's citation of Hosea explicitly frames Herod and Jesus' encounter in light of the Exodus. Caesar's involvement in the matter is, therefore, irrelevant to Matthew. Caesar did not occupy the throne of David, nor did he see Jesus as a threat, nor did his decree cause Jesus to flee to a foreign land. Indeed, unlike Herod's, Caesar's decree is conducive to the fulfillment of God's purposes. Consequently, a description of Caesar's involvement in Jesus' birth would only dilute and confuse Matthew's narrative. And, as we will now see, in the next video, the same is true of Luke's, mutatis mutandis.